The two pigs were magnificent. They were not merely fat, they were architecture. Each was a vast, breathing structure of pink hide and profound contentment, gleaming under the hard August sun as if polished with oil. Their sides were barrels, their hams were hills, and their little eyes, nearly lost in the prosperous swell of their cheeks, were bright with an intelligence born of absolute security. They lay in the shade of the one good oak, occasionally twitching a velvet ear at a fly, the very picture of porcine royalty. The man standing at the fence, a butcher named Cobb from 2 counties over, had taken his hat off as if in church. He'd heard a rumor, a whisper on the wind about the widow girl on the old Miller place, and had ridden 3 hours out of his way on a hunch. A hunch did not prepare him for this. He ran a hand over his sweating scalp and made a soft whistling sound. "Lord above," he murmured to Elspeth, who stood beside him, still and silent. "I've been in this trade 20 years. I've seen hogs from prize-winning stock, fed on buttermilk and corn till they burst. I have never seen the like. Not once." Elspeth said nothing. She just watched her pigs, General Grant and Mrs. Peabody, who had, in their quiet way, saved her. Cobb replaced his hat and turned to face her fully, his eyes narrowed with professional calculation. "What are you feeding them, ma'am? If it's not a secret." "Melons," she said, her voice plain. Cobb blinked. "Melons?" "They were bruised," she added, as if that explained everything. It explained nothing. He looked from her small, determined frame to the beasts in the shade, and then back again. He saw the dust on her dress and the resolve in her jaw. He was a man who understood the arithmetic of flesh and bone, and the equation before him made no sense. It was impossible. And yet, there it was, breathing deeply in the shade. 4 months earlier, the equation had been much simpler, and its answer was ruin. Elspeth was 24 years old, a widow of less than a year, and the sole heir to 40 acres of stubborn clay soil that had broken her husband's heart before it broke his body. The townsfolk of Promise Creek spoke of her with that particular brand of pity that is mostly a judgment. "A young woman alone," they'd say to each other over the counters of the mercantile. "Can't run a place like this. It's not meant for it. She'll sell for a song before the first snow." She had the 40 acres, a sway-backed barn, a house that let the wind in through its teeth, and 2 pigs. The pigs had been her husband's last, desperate investment, bought as runts and now stubbornly refusing to thrive. They were scrawny, listless things with ribs like washboards and a cough that rattled in the thin spring air. They were a mirror of her own fortunes, hanging on, but just barely. She kept her accounts in a little ledger at night, the arithmetic of survival. The cost of feed against the price of pork, the debt at the mercantile against the dwindling cash in the pickle jar. Every night, the numbers told the same story. Every night, she closed the book, refusing to write down the final sum. One Tuesday in late April, the story changed. A boy came running into town with news that the morning freight train had snagged a rail 5 miles east. One of the cars, a boxcar filled with early melons from the south, had tipped and split its gut. Its contents, 500 cantaloupes destined for markets in the city, were now scattered down an embankment, a cascade of bruised, split, and hopelessly unsellable fruit. The railroad agent, a man with a perpetually harried expression, declared the entire shipment a loss. He just wanted it gone. The cost of hiring a crew to clear the mess was more than he was willing to spend. To anyone who would haul it away, he'd sell the lot, as is, where is. Most people heard this and shrugged. What good was a mountain of ruined melon? It was flybait. It was rot. It was a sticky, stinking mess waiting to happen. But Elsbeth heard something else. She heard water. She heard sugar. She heard life. She walked the 5 miles to the derailment site, her mind a quiet storm of calculation. The agent saw her coming, a lone woman in a faded calico dress, and his face softened with the familiar town pity. "Nothing for you here, ma'am," he said, gesturing at the pile. "Total loss." "I'll take them," Elspeth said. The agent blinked. "All of them?" "Yes." He squinted, certain he'd misheard. "Ma'am, they're spoiled, bruised clear through. No one will buy them." "I'm not going to sell them," she said. "What will you do with them?" he asked, his voice full of genuine, baffled curiosity. "Feed my pigs," she said. A silence fell, broken only by the buzzing of the first flies arriving at the feast. The agent looked at her, then at the mountain of melons, and a slow grin spread across his face. It wasn't a kind grin. It was the grin of a man who's just heard the funniest, saddest joke in the world. "All right then," he said, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "You want 500 ruined melons to feed 2 scrawny pigs? $15, and you haul 'em yourself." It was almost all the money she had left in the world. She untied the knot in her handkerchief and counted the coins and bills into his hand. He took it, still shaking his head. As she turned to leave, he called after her, "You'll be the melon queen of Promise Creek." The laughter of the railroad crew followed her all the way back to the rutted track that led home. She didn't mind. She was too busy doing the arithmetic. $15 for what might be a whole summer of feed. It was a gamble on a scale that made her hands tremble. But it was the only gamble she had left to make. She hitched up her old wagon, the wheels groaning in protest, and headed back toward the wreck. The work was brutal. The melons were heavy and slick, their bruised skins weeping a sticky, sweet juice that attracted every wasp and fly for miles. She loaded the wagon until the old mule strained against the harness, hauled it back to the farm, and dumped the load near the pig pen. Then she turned around and went back for more. Day after day she made the trip, a solitary, stubborn figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. The story of her purchase traveled faster than she did. It became the talk of the town. At the mercantile, Mr. Abernathy, the grain merchant who bought all the local hogs, held court. He was a large man, soft in a way that spoke of prosperity earned from other people's sweat. "Did you hear about the Miller widow?" he'd ask, his voice booming with false concern. "Bought a trainload of garbage, pouring her last dollar into rot. It's a shame, a real shame. That land will be up for auction by fall. Mark my words." The men around him would nod and chuckle. They were farmers, practical men who understood the value of corn and the cost of foolishness. Feeding pigs on spoiled fruit was worse than foolish. It was an unnatural act. Pigs needed grain, solid and sensible, to make good pork. Everyone knew that. The women whispered it over their fences. Poor thing. Her grief has turned her mind. Someone should speak to her. She can't manage alone. Elspeth heard the whispers. She saw the pitying looks and the knowing smirks when she went into town for salt and flour. She met them all with a quiet stillness, her face giving nothing away. She did not argue or explain. Being right, she was beginning to understand, was not a thing you talked about. It was a thing you built, shovelful by shovelful, in silence. She built it with aching muscles and blistered hands. By the end of the first week, a veritable mountain of melons sat behind her barn, a lumpy, fragrant ziggurat of hope and decay. The smell was overwhelming, a complex perfume of sweet fermentation and earthy rot. The flies were a living cloud. The town saw a monument to folly. Elspeth saw a pantry. She took a hatchet and split the first melon. The flesh inside was bruised, yes, but it was still sweet. A deep, honeyed orange. She tossed the two halves over the fence into the pig pen. General Grant and Mrs. Peabody, who had been huddled listlessly in the corner, lifted their heads. They sniffed the air. They shuffled forward. The general, always the bolder of the two, nudged the melon with his snout, then took a tentative bite. A moment of porcine consideration passed. Then his eyes widened slightly, and he began to eat with a sudden, astonishing ferocity, his grunts and snorts echoing in the quiet yard. Mrs. Peabody, seeing her chance diminish, rushed in and joined him. For the first time since they'd arrived on the farm, they ate as if they might live. Elspeth watched them, her back screaming in protest from the hauling, her hands sticky with juice, and allowed herself a small, weary smile. It was not a victory yet, but it was a start. The arithmetic was beginning to change. The next morning, as she was chopping a fresh batch of melons, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Old Man Hemlock leaning on her fence. He was a German immigrant who had a small, tidy farmstead down the road, a place known for its immaculate beehives and the old country wisdom of its owner. He was one of the few people in Promise Creek who had never offered her pity, only a quiet, respectful nod when they passed. He surveyed the mountain of melons, his pale blue eyes taking in the scale of it. He looked at the pigs, who were already waiting eagerly at the trough, and then he looked at her. "The town," he said, his voice a low rumble with the accent of his homeland, "says you are a fool." Elspeth straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron. "The town says a lot of things. They say you feed your animals garbage." "It's not garbage if it's eaten," she replied, her voice steady. Hemlock nodded slowly, a faint smile touching his lips. He pointed a gnarled finger at the pile. "My father, back in the old country, he used to say, 'Waste is only a failure of the eye.' You look, you see what is there, not what you are told is there." He pushed himself off the fence and walked over to the pile, picking up a split melon. He sniffed it deeply. "Yeah, good, strong." He looked back at her, his eyes kind. "The sugar will make them fat. The water will keep them healthy. It is good feed, unconventional, but good." That simple validation was like a balm on her raw spirit. It was the first time anyone had looked at her work and seen sense instead of madness. "The flies are bad," she admitted, "and the smell." "Lime," he said simply. "Get a sack of lime and spread it around the base. It will keep the rot clean and the flies down. And turn the pile every few days with a pitchfork. Let the air in. You are not raising melons, you are managing decay. It is a different kind of farming." He stayed for an hour, showing her how to score the rinds so the pigs could get at the flesh more easily, how to spot the melons that were too far gone and should be buried. He spoke of the land and the patience it required, of the quiet observation that yielded more than brute force. When he left, Elspeth felt a profound shift inside her. She was no longer just a lone woman gambling against ruin. She was a farmer, managing her assets. The work found its rhythm. Every morning before the sun was fully up, she was out with the hatchet, the rhythmic thunk, 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 a steady heartbeat for the farm. She'd fill the long wooden trough with the bright orange flesh, and the pigs would come running, their squeals of anticipation a morning chorus. She followed Hemlock's advice, turning the pile, spreading the lime. The smell lessened, the flies abated. The mountain of melons was not a festering heap of rot. It was a managed resource, a silo of sweetness that she was drawing down, one wheelbarrow at a time. A few weeks into this new routine, she gained an assistant. A boy named Silas, the youngest son of the grim-faced widow on the neighboring farm, started appearing at her fence line. He was a whisper of a boy, all sharp angles and watchful eyes, who rarely spoke. At first, He just watched from a distance. Then, one morning, he slipped through the fence and stood by the chopping block. Elspeth, sensing his shyness, didn't press him. She just kept chopping. After a few minutes of silence, he pointed a thin finger at the hatchet. "Can I?" he asked, his voice barely audible. She considered it. He was small, but he had a look of quiet competence about him. She handed him the hatchet. "Keep your thumb tucked," she said. He nodded and set to work. His swings were clumsy at first, but he was careful. Soon, he found a rhythm of his own. From then on, he arrived every morning. They worked in comfortable silence, the two of them, the young woman and the quiet boy, turning a mountain of waste into sustenance. Silas never said why he came, but Elspeth understood. On his own family's farm, a place of grim necessity and little joy, he was just another mouth to feed. Here, he had a purpose. He was a partner in a strange and secret enterprise. He took a particular liking to the pigs, who were beginning a transformation so dramatic it felt like a kind of magic. The listlessness was gone, replaced by a vigorous, joyful energy. Their ribs vanished beneath a growing layer of fat. Their hides, once dull and scurfy, turned a healthy, glossy pink. Their coughs disappeared. They were becoming, undeniably, fat. Silas would talk to them as he poured the melon mash into their trough, calling them by the names Elspeth had given them. "Here you go, General," he'd murmur. "Eat up, Mrs. Peabody." He treated them with a solemn respect, as if they were colleagues in this grand experiment. By June, the change was undeniable. The pigs were no longer just fat, they were becoming colossal. Elspeth kept them in the back pasture, hidden from the main road, guarding her success like a secret coal banked low under ash. She knew, with a certainty that hummed deep in her bones, that it was too soon to show the world. The world was not ready to be proven wrong. Mockery, once it takes root in a town's mind, is a hard weed to pull. Her nightly arithmetic took on a new character. Before, it had been the grim counting of debts. Now, it was the joyful calculus of growth. Feed cost, 0. Labor, her own. Weight gain, astronomical. She was spinning gold from garbage, and no one knew but her, a quiet boy, and an old German beekeeper. She still had to endure the town. When she went to the mercantile for supplies, the whispers still followed her. "Still got that pile of rot?" a farmer might ask, a smirk playing on his lips. "The melon queen," another would chuckle. Mr. Abernathy was the worst. He'd see her and adopt a tone of deep, condescending sympathy. "Elspeth," he'd say, placing a soft hand on her arm. "I hope you know, when the time comes, I'll give you a fair price for that land. No one will hold this melon business against you." He was circling, a vulture waiting for the inevitable. He wanted her land, which bordered his own prime fields. And he believed her foolishness was clearing the path for him to get it for pennies on the dollar. She would simply nod, her face a mask of placid calm. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Abernathy," she would say, and walk away. It infuriated him, her refusal to crumble. It was like talking to a stone wall. He could not see the vast, thriving secret she was building behind it. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The sky turned a hard, bleached blue, empty of clouds. The rain, which had been sparse all summer, stopped entirely. The creeks shrank, pulling back from their banks to reveal cracked, thirsty mud. The corn in the fields, which had promised a bumper crop, began to suffer. The leaves curled in on themselves, turning a sickly yellow-gray. The stalks, which should have been swelling with milky kernels, stood brittle and barren. A week of this heat turned into 2, then 3. The dust from the road coated everything in a fine, gritty powder. The town's mood, which had been one of smug amusement at Elspeth's expense, curdled into a low-grade collective anxiety. Men stood in silent groups outside the mercantile, staring at the merciless sky. The price of corn and feed began to climb. Abernathy, who had more livestock than anyone, wore a permanent scowl. His own hogs, fed on expensive grain that now had to be supplemented with water hauled from a dwindling well, were lean and agitated. Their squeals had a thin, desperate edge. The whole county was drying up. But on Elspeth's 40 acres, a small miracle was underway. The mountain of melons, which had seemed like such a liability, was now an oasis. Each melon was a vessel of water and sugar, a perfect food for a drought. While other animals suffered from thirst, General Grant and Mrs. Peabody were hydrated and happy, their thirst slaked by the juicy pulp they devoured each day. They continued to expand, oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding around them. They were living in their own private land of milk and honey, or rather, of melon and mash. The secret could not be kept forever. Rumors, like thistle seeds, travel on a dry wind. A neighbor, looking for a stray calf, cut across Elspeth's back pasture and saw them. He stopped dead in his tracks, stared for a full 5 minutes, and went straight to town. The story he told was so outlandish that at first no one believed him. "Hogs big as horses," he claimed, his eyes wide. "Shiny as new pennies." But the seed was planted. It was this rumor that brought Mr. Cobb, the butcher from 2 counties over, to her fence line. He was a man whose business depended on finding quality stock, and the drought had made that nearly impossible. He was following the faintest wisp of a lead, expecting nothing. And he found himself looking at the 2 most magnificent pigs he had ever seen. After his initial shock, his professional instincts took over. He walked the fence line, his eyes assessing their length, their depth, their finish. He was doing his own arithmetic, and the numbers were dazzling. "Ma'am," he said, turning back to Elspeth, his voice now stripped of all wonder and full of business. "I'll give you top dollar for the pair, the highest price you've ever heard for market hogs. Cash money, right now." He named a figure. It was a staggering amount, more money than Elspeth had ever seen in one place. It was enough to pay off all her debts, buy feed for a year, fix the roof, and still have a healthy sum left over in the pickle jar. It was security. It was vindication. It was the final, triumphant answer to her nightly calculations. She felt a dizzying rush of relief. It had worked. All the back-breaking labor, all the mockery and pity, it had all led to this moment. She looked at General Grant and Mrs. Peabody dozing peacefully. She looked at Silas, who had come to stand beside her, his face a mixture of pride and anxiety at the thought of them leaving. "Let me think on it," she told the butcher. He nodded, understanding that a prize of this magnitude deserved a moment's consideration. "I'll be at the town hotel until morning," he said. "The offer stands." Word of Cobb's offer flew through Promise Creek like a prairie fire. The butcher was a known man, a serious businessman. If he had made such an offer, the rumors were true. The Melon Queen wasn't mad. She was a miracle worker. The perception of the town flipped on its head overnight. The pity turned to awe, the mockery to a grudging, disbelieving respect. People who had laughed at her now spoke of her cleverness. They reframed her folly as foresight. "Always knew she had a good head on her shoulders," they'd say, conveniently forgetting their earlier predictions of her ruin. It is easier to believe a thing is clever than to admit you were wrong to mock it. The one person who was not pleased was Mr. Abernathy. The news struck him like a physical blow. He had been so certain of her failure, so confident in his own superior judgment. Her success was a direct refutation of his worldview. It was also a threat. With the drought, good pork was scarce and prices were about to skyrocket. He had planned to control the market, buying up what little stock there was for cheap and selling dear. Now, this woman, this girl, had cornered the market with two perfect animals fattened on garbage. That evening, his buggy rattled up her lane. He did not wait for her to come out, but strode onto her porch as if he owned it. "Elspeth," he said, his voice slick with a false warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "I heard a ridiculous story in town. Some out-of-county butcher making wild offers." "It's true," she said, her voice even. She was not intimidated. She had faced down ruin. A pompous grain merchant was nothing. Abernathy's smile tightened. "Now listen. You don't want to deal with strangers. They'll try to cheat you. You're a local girl. You should sell to local folk. I'll take them off your hands. I'll even beat his price. By $5. He said it as if he were bestowing a great favor. It was a paltry, insulting increase over Cobb's offer, a transparent attempt to use his position and her perceived naivety to steal her prize. He was still playing the old game, still seeing her as the foolish widow who needed a man to tell her what her property was worth. "No, thank you, Mr. Abernathy," she said calmly. His face hardened. The mask of concern fell away, revealing the cold greed beneath. "Don't be a fool, girl. This is a one-time thing, a fluke. You got lucky with your rotten melons. Take the money and be sensible." "I believe I am being sensible," she said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have chores to do." She turned to go back inside. His voice, sharp and ugly, stopped her. "You'll regret this. A woman alone can't make it in this business. You need men like me. I'll see to it no one in this town buys so much as a single ham from you." It was a threat, plain and simple. He would use his influence to punish her for her defiance. She paused in the doorway and looked back at him, the setting sun framing her silhouette. "A thing is only worth what someone is willing to pay, Mr. Abernathy. I believe that's what you always say. It seems my pigs are worth quite a lot." She closed the door, leaving him standing alone on her porch, his face flushed with impotent rage. His departure left a sour taste in the air. The joy of her vindication was now complicated by fear. Abernathy was a powerful man in their small world. He controlled the grain, the credit, the market. His threat was not an idle one. She sat at her kitchen table long into the night, the ledger open before her, but for once, she wasn't looking at the numbers. She was thinking about the town, about the pinched faces she saw at the mercantile, the worried conversations that stopped when she approached. She thought about Abernathy's hogs, lean and hungry, and then about her own, fat and content. Her success felt isolated, a private victory in a sea of public hardship. The arithmetic of survival was no longer just about her. The next morning, another visitor came. It was Martha Hale, Silas's mother. She was a proud, hard woman, worn down by work and worry, who had never had a kind word for Elspeth. She stood at the edge of the yard, her hands twisting in her apron, refusing to come closer. "I heard," she said, not meeting Elspeth's eyes, "about the offer, about Abernathy." Her voice was tight with a mixture of shame and desperation. "My children," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "We butchered our own hog last week, thin as a rake. There's not much left. Abernathy won't extend our credit for flour. With the corn gone—" She trailed off, unable to finish. She didn't have to. Elspeth knew what it meant. It meant hunger. Real hunger, the kind that gnawed at a family's strength and stole its future. This was the true cost of the drought. This was the problem her two fat pigs could solve. In that moment, the choice became clear. It wasn't about the highest bidder. It wasn't about punishing Mr. Abernathy or proving herself to the town. It was about the empty larders and the worried mothers. It was about feeding her neighbors. "I'm not selling them," Elspeth said, and saw the flicker of hope in Martha Hale's eyes die. Not to Mr. Cobb, not to Mr. Abernathy. She took a deep breath. I'm going to butcher them myself. I'll be selling the meat tomorrow morning, at the pre-drought price. Martha Hale looked up, her face a mask of disbelief. To sell at the old price, when she could demand 3 or 4 times that, was unthinkable. It was an act of shocking, radical generosity. Why? She whispered. Because hunger is a poor neighbor, Elspeth said simply. She sent Silas into town with a notice, which he nailed to the post outside the mercantile. It was written in her clear, steady hand. Pork for sale, Miller Farm, Sunrise, fair prices. The notice was a declaration of independence. She was cutting out the middleman. She was creating her own market on her own terms. That afternoon, Old Man Hemlock arrived with his long knives, a sharpening steel, and a block and tackle. He said nothing about her decision, but the approval in his eyes was all the confirmation she needed. Together, with Silas helping to haul water and stoke the fire, they did the hard, necessary work. It was a somber and bloody business, but it was honest. They worked into the night, turning the 2 magnificent animals into clean, marketable cuts of meat: hams, bacon, chops, roasts, and sausage. They rendered the fat into pure white lard. Nothing was wasted. It was the final step in the transformation, turning the summer's sunlight, stored in the flesh of melons and pigs, into food that would see the community through the hard times to come. Before dawn, they were already lining up. A quiet, orderly procession of wagons and buggies snaked down her lane. It was the whole town. They came with sacks and baskets, their faces showing a mixture of hope and humility. Mr. Abernathy came too. He drove his buggy to the front of the line, intending to use his cash to buy her entire stock and control it himself. I'll take it all, he announced, pulling out a thick wallet. At your fair price. The crowd murmured, sensing the injustice. Elspeth, wiping her hands on her bloody apron, looked him square in the eye. 1 portion per family, Mr. Abernathy, she said, her voice clear and carrying over the quiet crowd. Until everyone has been served. He sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. That's not how business is done. It's how it's being done today, she said. Defeated and publicly shamed, he had no choice but to take his single portion and retreat, the eyes of the entire town on his back. One by one, she served her neighbors. She weighed the meat on her husband's old scale, her hands sure and steady. She gave fair weight, and then a little extra for the children. She saw the relief on their faces, the gratitude that was deeper than words. They were the same people who had pitied and mocked her. But she felt no triumph, only a deep, quiet satisfaction. She was not the melon queen, the foolish widow. She was Elspeth Miller, the woman who fed her town. By noon it was all gone. The tables were clean, the money tucked away in the pickle jar. It was less than the butcher would have paid, but it felt like more. It felt like wealth of a different kind. Silas was sweeping the barn, a new sense of importance in his posture. Old Man Hemlock sat with her on the porch steps, sipping cool water from a dipper. The air was still hot, the sky still a merciless blue, but something had broken. The drought was still on the land, but it was no longer in the people's hearts. You did a good thing, Hemlock said. Elspeth looked out over her 40 acres of stubborn clay. It didn't look so poor anymore. It looked like a place that could provide. It looked like home. You told me waste is only a failure of the eye, she said. I suppose value is too. You have to look for it. You have to see what's really there. He smiled, his weathered face cracking into 1,000 gentle lines. Yeah, he said, nodding. You look, you see. And in the quiet of the afternoon, with the promise of survival settled over the valley, she knew he was right. She had looked past the rot. past the mockery, past the easy judgment of others, and she had seen. She had seen the water in the waste and the gold in the garbage, and she had built a future from what nobody wanted.